First thing I'd like to do is ask if people could please put your cell phones on stun or turn them off. We'd appreciate that. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Aaron. I'd like to welcome you to Temple Emanuel this evening. Rabbi Geller and I are honored to be the leaders of a congregation that organized this town hall. And I'd like to acknowledge one of our presidents, Scott Schlechter, who's here this evening. If you please stand. Thank you very much. But more than that, we are very grateful to this outstanding panel that we brought together with our colleagues who have joined us here this evening. Rabbi Judith Halevi, representing the Board of Rabbis. Just give a little wave. Great. Rabbi Yosef Konevsky of B'nai David Judea. Rabbi Nicole Guzik, Director of Sinai Temple Israel Center. Shep Rosenman from Limud LA. And Rabbi David Eliezri, President of the Rabbinic Council of Orange County. And of course, Rabbi Geller of Temple Emanuel. We would also like to thank the many different synagogues and educational institutions and community organizations who are our co-sponsors. If there are any leaders, rabbis from any of these institutions here, if you please stand and let us acknowledge you at this time. Thank you for supporting this event and for being here this evening. But most of all, we'd like to thank Consul General David Siegel, who responded to our invitation to join us tonight because of his conviction that American Jews have a stake in what happens in Israel. Though the community might disagree on solutions to the difficult challenges that Israel faces, we are a community that can discuss those challenges and acknowledge our differences in a respectful and a constructive way. When we originally planned this town hall, we couldn't have anticipated the crisis in Israel that Israel is now experiencing. Some people suggested that we should cancel this town hall, that internal issues like religious pluralism are not important in the face of real security threats that Israel has been facing, and the onslaught of missiles directed towards our families and our friends. But our Consul General asks that we go forward, reminding us that just as an entire community can come together during a crisis, when Israel is threatened from the outside, we who love Israel can come together to think creatively about the challenges that Israel is facing from within. In a moment, Rabbi Halevi will formally introduce the Consul General, and he will begin with some remarks about the current crisis in Gaza, and then share his thoughts about the issue of religious pluralism that was sparked by the recent arrests of women praying at the Western Wall. So I'd like to welcome Rabbi Halevi.
So I would like to thank you for the great honor of being able to introduce Consul General David Siegel. And we are here this evening to explore civil discourse, pluralism, and bridge building between this community and the community in Israel, as we are one Klal Yisrael, and the greatest bridge builder that Israel could have shared with us is David. Let's face it, they'll give you a whole resume. The most important thing is his father was a conservative rabbi. May all rabbis have children who grow up to be the Consul General. But as such, Consul General David Siegel serves as the guide and bridge builder connecting our two communities, and has done so since he came in 2011 in a way that has been unparalleled. Yes, I need to read to you from the little script because it's important that you know that he served 2 terms with the Embassy of Israel in Washington, D.C., in successive roles as Chief of Staff to 3 of Israel's ambassadors to the United States, Counselor for Congressional Affairs, and spokesperson. In these capacities, which spanned nearly a decade and 2 U.S. administrations, Mr. Siegel was deeply involved in policy coordination with the State Department, National Security Council, and the White House, etc., etc., etc. What's really important is that this human being understands what it is to be an Israeli. He's a commander in the Israeli Armed Forces, and what it means to be an American. He went to school in Vermont. His BA in political science is from the University of Vermont, and he went to the Fletcher School of Diplomacy, Boston. Most important, this is a human being with a heart big enough to be inclusive, perceptive, and to guide all of us across the bridge. That bridge span, in the words of Rabbi Nachman, the whole world is a very narrow bridge. This week it seemed very shaky. The most important thing is not to be afraid. We're not afraid to be here tonight under your guidance to discuss the tough issues. And we thank you for having the courage to lead us across and to strengthen the bridges between the United States and Israel as one Klal Yisrael. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi, all rabbis, and all of you for being here. It's been quite a week. Operation Pillar of Defense just ended. Hopefully, the results that we're seeing will stick, and the people of Israel will no more be under the kind of rocket fire assault that we have seen. Unfortunately, for almost a decade, the first rocket fired into Israel was in 2001. We're now in 2012. 2012 was, even before this operation, twice the number of missiles the year before, 3 times the missiles the year before that. So that this was a very, very intense week in Israel. You've all heard, I'm assuming, the stories, and you've seen the numbers. Some of you have been to Israel this week, last week, felt it yourself. It was very tragic, very unfortunate. This was a defensive operation. We were able to stop the fire. Hopefully we'll also tackle the issue of smuggling and other issues that directly affect the security of the people of Israel, because 5 million people had to be in bomb shelters or in that vicinity of bomb shelters because the rockets reached Tel Aviv, and for the first time in half a century reached Jerusalem. This was a very, very significant trauma that will be with us for many, many months to come. But hopefully, this defensive operation has brought an end to the rocket fire. We can restore normalcy and peace to Israel South and now to Israel Center as well. Now, there were comments in the community and thoughts about maybe putting off this event because of the situation that we had last week. Our attitude was, this issue is important, you are important to us, this conversation is important to us, and we don't cancel Jewish events. So here we are. And before I start with internal issues in Israel, just one more word. Our hearts go out to those who were affected by this conflict. Our thanks go to the United States for supporting us in this conflict. From the administration, the White House, the Congress, to, I don't know if you know, but the governors, all Democratic governors, all Republican governors, also locally and certainly across this nation, came out and supported Israel's right to defend itself last week. And it's a very, very significant moment in this world. One more half comment. We are also deeply, deeply grateful for what what America did in terms of funding this amazing technology, which is called Iron Dome, which is revolutionizing the way we conduct these kind of operations in the world. 85% success rate in intercepting 421 rockets that would have fallen on civilian communities. This is the fruit of the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is incredible. Now I'm going to put all that aside, thank you very much, and talk about what we're here to discuss this evening. Now, I want to tell you a tiny bit about myself. My dad was a conservative dox rabbi. So I grew up in a home that was partially Orthodox, partially conservative. I was sent to an all-boys Orthodox yeshiva until I joined the military at the age of 18. So I went through the entire world of Judaism, from my secular, larger family in the United States to my Orthodox and sometimes ultra-Orthodox colleagues that I grew up with. I was in Bnei Akiva, which is an Orthodox youth movement, and on weekends I was in an Anglo pluralistic environment, which was very, very different from everything else that I went through during the week. So Friday morning I was at Orthodox Shacharit, Orthodox Mincha. We'd go home and then everything would turn around and I'd be in a conservative synagogue for Shabbat evening, and then Shabbat afternoon, I'd be back at Bnei Akiva, davening Orthodox again. So this is my life. So here we are. Now, we moved to Israel in the late 1960s. The reason we moved to Israel is that my father was a conservative rabbi and wanted to be one of the founding members of the movement in Israel. And the Masorti movement in Israel in those days was called Conservativi, not a Hebrew word. Nobody knew what we were talking about. No one had any idea what we were. And in fact, the secular Israelis were even more complicated about this than the Orthodox Israelis, because no one understood this third way. There was no third way in Israel. And when the law passed in 1967, after the Six-Day War, adjudicating the way we deal with the holy sites of all religions, not just Jewish religion, not just the Jewish religion, there was no presence to this community in Israel. And if there was, it was tiny. My dad was the second conservative rabbi in Israel. Today, how many rabbis do we have in Israel of the pluralist movement? Does anyone have a count? Around 120, I may be wrong, maybe more, maybe less. Roughly 120, thank you. We have gone from 2, maybe some on the Reform side, to 120. We have gone from 2 disconnected rabbis and 1 congregation in Jerusalem that didn't have a rabbi, to a community which today is what we call the pluralistic lobby, or the lobby for Jewish renewal in Israel. And if we can maybe show some of what is happening in Israel today that you might want to start looking at in terms of organizations that may inspire you, that are dealing with these very issues that we're discussing tonight. Not just about Anad Hoffman and a controversy about arrangements for prayer at the Western Wall, but the whole panoply of Jewish life in Israel. And what does it mean to be a sovereign Jewish state? And how do you mesh democracy with Judaism? Are they indeed contradictory, or can you actually work on this together? And the end result is that from the 2 rabbis in the late 60s, today you'll find in polling in Israel over 500,000 Israelis that identify with this. 500,000. 40,000 Israelis go through pluralistic programs every year. The Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, their curriculum is being taught in 120 high schools, elite high schools in Israel. The Tali school program is waitlisted all over Israel because they have some of the best educational institutes in Israel. This is just part of the picture. This comes from a website called Panim, P-A-N-I-M. You can look it up. And you will find inspirational articles, links to every one of these organizations. Some of these are think tanks that do the kind of work that we're here to discuss tonight. I think the message is clear enough that if you care about Jewish renewal or activities around Judaism in Israel, you're not alone. And I have more news for you. Some of these organizations are Orthodox. We call them liberal Orthodox. And they are working together in coalitions with secular Israelis, and some of them are working together with the Masorti, the conservative, and the Reform movement in Israel. And Rabbi Gilad Karif, who is the head of the Reform movement in Israel, who is now running in the Labor Party in the elections coming up in January. So you see, they're moving from the Bet Knesset to the Knesset. We are moving, this is becoming political. So it's coming with more political muscle. So these people believe in coalitions. And I think what we need to do in LA, as a model, hopefully for other communities, is to start looking at ourselves as a coalition. We could disagree about theology, but meanwhile we're losing the younger generation that is disconnected. People are alienated or apathetic, and I think what we all share in this bima is a commitment to remain Jewish and to build the next generation as a Jewish generation, no matter what we believe theologically. So this is what we're here for tonight. Now, there's a debate about whether Israel has gotten worse or better when it comes to pluralism. I don't think there's a debate. I simply don't see it. 2 rabbis, to over 120, and add to them all of this, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, all gathering together. They're all involved in the major parties. Listen to Yair Lapid and how he talked to the Rabbinical Assembly in Atlanta, and how he was talking about Jewish renewal and pluralism in Israel, or other political leaders in Israel. And you'll find people in this coalition, which is now a lobby, running in all the mainstream parties in Israel. In Kadima, in Likud, in Labor, in Meretz, and some also in the Orthodox political parties. Yair Lapid has 2 Haredi people on his list, and they're all running together. Have you heard of Rabbi Amsalem? This is a name that you should learn a lot about. We should all learn about. Rabbi Amsalem is revolutionizing orthodoxy and politics in Israel. Now we'll see what the results are in these elections, and I'm not a politician, I'm here as a diplomat, but I'm sharing with you a reality in Israel that you should know about. All of these organizations need funding. All of these organizations that are dealing with these issues that are important to Jewish America, all of these organizations are open to a partnership with you. So we can debate an Hoffman, right or wrong, and we can do that until we're blue in the face. There's still a law that regulates it. That law was passed in the Knesset in 1967. You want to change the law? Get involved politically and be part of this coalition that's trying to change things. Petitioning the Supreme Court, going to the Knesset, trying to change the law, reinterpret whatever needs to be reinterpreted. This has all been done, and it needs to continue. So we're now, right now, in Israel, the latest news that you all know, and I will wrap this up in one moment, is that there's the first non-Orthodox rabbi that will be paid by the state. Now, is that enough? No. Is that a beginning? Yes. Are there further petitions in the Supreme Court in Israel to broaden that from rural areas to urban areas and on and on and on? Of course. Rabbi Gilad Karif said something very inspiring before he announced that he was going to run in the Labor Party. He said, building a Jewish state is a marathon. If you want to be in this, you've got to be in this for the long term. My final message to you is that Israel is constantly changing, constantly in motion, even in that ultra-Orthodox community that some people are so turned away from. Well, that community is going through tremendous change. There are huge debates in Israel today, and they're critical for Israel's future, not just for the future of our relationship. They're now authentic Israeli issues. Who should serve in the military? How many Haredim should serve in the military? Can the army absorb as many Haredim as each year become available for military service? The answer is no, not yet. Yes, somewhat. So there's a process, and that process is in motion, and Israel's debating it in terms of our own future. So this is where we converge. Your issues, our issues, the future of Israel, the integration of the Arab community in Israel, the integration of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. And by the way, ultra-Orthodox women are working. It's the men that is the issue that we need to work on more. So, no, this is serious, and the inverse is the case on the Arab side. There's much more of an issue with Arab women not working than Arab men working. So there's a lot to do that is critical to the future of Israel. And that guarantees that these issues will be front and center in Israel's politics. Be part of it. Be inspired by it. Don't be turned away by headlines that argue about what's happening at the wall. Be inspired by all of this motion, all of this inclusiveness, and it's time to bring some of those organizations here and some of those voices here so that you can be inspired by what they're trying to change. This is the real Israel. Israel is constantly changing, constantly in motion. We should all be part of this partnership. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Rob Eshman. I'm the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Jewish Journal. I'm not a rabbi. I wanted to welcome you all, and I just wanted to add my voice to say how impressed I am that the Consul General went through this. This was planned long before the problems with Gaza, and the Consul General insisted on going through this. It was a very keep calm and carry on kind of moment, and appreciate that. Usually the Jewish response is keep calm and we develop, but this was a good one. I'm going to lead a discussion among the participants up here on the panel, and then we're going to do that for a while, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Please keep your questions short. Please keep your questions as questions, question mark at the end. At the end of that, after that, we can conclude this with a few more remarks from the Consul General if he wishes, and then there's some refreshments out there so we could all mingle and carry on this conversation outside. So I wanted to get right into it, and I wanted to start by asking Rabbi Geller. The Consul General painted a fairly optimistic picture of the direction things are going in Israel. I just wanted to maybe play the devil's advocate and point out that one of the things that prompted this was the arrest of Nat Hoffman, who's been an Israeli civil rights activist, feminist, who's been going to the wall and leading services for 23 years. She put on a tefillin, she read from the Torah, which is forbidden by law at the wall. She was dragged away, arrested, strip searched at the police station, and held in custody for overnight. And that's what really prompted kind of the original idea for this. So, from your perspective as a Reform rabbi, are things improving for pluralism in Israel?
So, can people hear me? No.
People hear me now?
Yes.
Again, welcome all of you to Temple Emanuel. One of the ways Temple Emanuel describes itself as believing that there's more than one way to be a Jew. And it would be lovely if that were also true in Israel. It's ironic that sometimes it feels that one of the few countries in the world where I can't be the kind of Jew I want to be is, in fact, in Israel. I have no idea why Anat was really arrested. As I understand the story, she wasn't wearing tefillin. She was wearing her talit wrapped around her neck as a scarf, which is technically legal, whereas it's not legal for a woman to wear a talit as a talit at the wall. And she was arrested very quickly after she began leading a group of 250 Gaza women in singing the Shema. Women have been gathering for Rosh Chodesh 11 times a year at the wall. This is permitted according to law for a long time. And while there have been occasional arrests, it's totally unclear to me why she was arrested this time. And then it happened again for Rosh Chodesh Kislev. I think 6 women were arrested just as the Rosh Chodesh service began. So I'm not sure what is going on at the wall to make this situation seem worse. On the other hand, I think everything that Consul General said is absolutely true. The victory of Miri Gold being recognized as a state rabbi is a victory. It's not a complete victory. This was a decision by the Supreme Court, and then there was pushback from a Shatz minister, and those positions of non-Orthodox rabbis who had been approved are funded now by
as opposed to the Ministry of Education. As opposed to the Ministry of Religion, and that has some implications for their funding. So this was a tremendous victory, but there was also pushback. So I think it's important to acknowledge that we're taking steps forward, and at the same time there are lots of steps backwards. I do want to say something about Anat Hoffman. She is famous not only for her work with Women at the Wall, which she does as a layperson, but she's also the director of the Israel Religious Action Center, the reform movement in Israel. And in that capacity, she has been a fearless leader around many other issues of religious pluralism, including segregated buses, issues of civil marriage, issues of advocating for Jews to be able to be buried, or Israelis who are not halachic Jews to be buried in Jewish cemeteries. These are issues that are very significant, and I think we owe a lot to Anat Hoffman for her very real leadership in these issues.
Rabbi Kusik, there was almost no reaction among women in Israel over the arrest of Anat Hoffman. They simply, as our reporter Shmuel Rosen said, they just don't care. Because praying at the wall is not something most women in Israel, the majority, really are concerned about. They're concerned on more day-to-day matters. If they are concerned about religious issues, it's about marriage, conversion, things like that. Why does it matter so much to American Jews here, your movement?
I think it matters here to our movement because what we're doing is teaching a contradiction to our children. I lead a leadership mission for teenagers every year at Sinai Temple. And it saddens me that when I see my kids, they're 9th graders, so when I see them after their bar and bat mitzvah, I certainly encourage them to wear their talit to shul. And then right before our trip, I have to gather our girls and let them know, just so you know, out of respect, which is a very funny and hard word to say, I'm going to ask you to take off your talis before we pray at the hotel. And so it's hard as a rabbi to teach contradictions to our children. It's hard to ask our teenagers to become involved religiously and socially in our movement. And then when we visit our Holy Land, where they're supposed to be a part of our people, to ask them to do otherwise. And I'm sure we'll speak further, but I think there are major ways that we can take a stance and a change here, right here in Los Angeles. We'll speak further, but I don't think our movement understands the word Masorti. I don't think our movement understands the word Merkaz. And so later on, I hope we'll have a chance to speak about public relations amongst our progressive strands.
Rabbi Eliezer, it's something that, by the same token, the kind of liberalization or the embrace of these movements that the Consul General is talking about, does that, as an Orthodox rabbi, concern you that there may be a lack of standards in this world?
First thing I wanted to touch about the issue of the wall for women. I feel like the Grinch can steal Christmas. And I have a beard, the yarmulke, I live in a black hat in the car, I don't know what's going to happen, what's going to happen. I know Rabbi Geller is a fine person who's going to protect me. That's what I hope.
That's why he's sitting next to me.
Yeah, she's going to protect me. A city rabbi protected by Laura Geller, Phil would love it. Anyway, but seriously speaking, with all seriously, just for a moment, we need to put just put Anat Hoffman in context. Is that there has been a tradition how Jews pray at the wall since King Solomon. 3,300, since the first temple was built. Men and women have been separate in the first temple, in the second temple. Classically, that's the way it's done, and it's always been according to traditional Jewish practice. When the liberal movements wanted to make a change in Israel, the Israeli Supreme Court designated a separate section of the wall and said you can have non-traditional prayer there. Anat Hoffman can pray there Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Shabbos, from sunrise to sunset, with a tallis, without a tallis, with tefillin, without tefillin, any way she wants. So why does she go to the wall to go and do what's name? Because Baruch Hashem, it's very good for public relations. She may have her passionate feeling, but if it's prayer, if it's davening, she feels a tremendous inner feeling, that she has another agenda over here. And by the way, the wall doesn't let a lot of things go on. For instance, I spoke to the chief rabbi of the wall a few weeks ago, and he told me, I don't let the Ger Rebbe run his tish, which means the leader of the Hasidic movement, Ger, which has tens and if not hundreds of thousands of followers in Israel cannot make a table and do a public event there because that's also not done on the wall. He doesn't provoke. So there was an historical compromise about the wall. And let's be very honest. If you would put up posters in Jerusalem that there's an area of the wall where men and women are praying mixed and it's not according to Jewish tradition, and you want to get a crowd, you can get a couple 100,000 people any Monday, Tuesday to protest. But the Orthodox community said, you know what? We don't agree with this. Live and let live. And not Hoffman says, I'm going to come down. And I find, independent of the disagreements between the liberal movements and traditional Judaism, and by the way, the word ultra-Orthodox is a very offensive term. I don't know why you're ultra if you happen to follow tradition, Jewish tradition law. I don't know if there's ultra-liberal. I don't know why there should be ultra-Orthodox. That's another conversation. But the point here is that there was an effort here to compromise. The only ones who compromised were the Orthodox. They didn't bother the services that they didn't agree with for philosophical and theological reasons, and they said live and let live. The only one who's trying to break the traditions that go back to King Solomon is a non-Hoffman.
So I just want to interrupt you on that point, since Rabbi Geller is protecting you, I wanted to respond to that. It's been done that way since time immemorial. Why change it, Rabbi Geller?
First of all, things change, and sometimes they change for the better. And while it's true that Robinson's Arch is a compromised place, Robinson's Arch does not have the same emotional valence as the actual Kotel. And if that is a solution, maybe the real solution is the area that we consider the Kotel, the plaza, maybe there should be 3 sections. A men's section, a women's section, and a mixed section right there, as opposed to the women being down the way, praying, yes, it's technically the Western Wall, but it is not the emotional Western Wall. And I think the question for us is, what does Israeli public space mean? And to whom does it belong? And who should control it?
I just want to bring Rabbi Kanevsky in. Is there a way to square the circle, and also kind of talking in the larger context, it's not just the wall, which is one issue, and as I said, as we kind of agree, maybe symbolic, but in the larger issue, is there a way that we can see to integrate more liberal stream Judaism into the civic role in Israeli life, in the public square?
I mean, there are remarkable things, as the Consul General has said, remarkable things that are happening in Israel with regard to secular yeshivas opening, with regard to Israelis gathering at the port of Tel Aviv on Friday nights for Kabbalat Shabbat, and that's not an isolated phenomenon. It's all over the country. And what the reason that these things are blossoming is that Israelis who do not identify themselves as being Dati and will not use that word to describe themselves have come to the recognition that for Israeli society to have coherence, and coherence isn't a luxury. When you're under fire, generation after generation, coherence is survival. The society has to understand who it is, why it is, what it's fighting for, what it stands for, and there's a growing recognition among non-Dati Israelis that this coherence is going to come through an embrace of Jewish learning and Jewish practice, not in an orthodox way, but through Jewish learning and Jewish practice in a way that is very much organically, intuitively theirs. This is the exciting thing that's happening. And I also think that this is one of the reasons that, and I guess glasses can be half full or half empty, the reform and conservative movements in Israel aren't the same as these emergent communities of Israelis. At least that's my understanding. That I've seen enough comments in a variety of different articles and essays that many of the Israelis who are involved in these emergent, do-it-yourself, express your spirituality in your own non-orthodox way are not identifying with reform and conservative movements per se because they regard them as being transplants, as not being organic. And for this reason, they don't speak to the Israelis who are at the forefront of these emergent spiritual, non Orthodox movements. Which leads me to the following place. It seems to me that the Kotel is the end of the process. In other words, when Israeli Jews who are discovering and exploring and re-energizing and renewing their Jewish learning and commitments, when those Israeli Jews come to the point of saying, you know what? The Kotel ought not to be an Orthodox synagogue. The Kotel ought to be the place where all Israelis who identify with prayer in any way, in every way, when they come to the conclusion that that's the kind of place the Kotel should be, that's when the Kotel will become that place. I think at this point, there are too many Israelis who don't care. It's not important to them what the Kotel is, what the Kotel isn't, as far as how prayer is carried out there. And when it's important to them, that's when things, I think, will change.
Would you, would you agree with that vision? Is that the vision you subscribe to, or would you say that's a diminution of traditional Judaism?
First thing we have to understand something about Israelis, especially if you look at the most interesting recent surveys, that religiosity among Israelis is growing. And in Tel Aviv, there is 550 Orthodox synagogues and there's one Reform temple. That's secular Tel Aviv. So people are voting with their feet. And we tend in America to look at the breakdown of Jews, that we see Jews who are not Orthodox observant and we say they're not Orthodox. But in Israel, the Jew who isn't fully Orthodox observant, which is true of most Western countries outside of Israel, in Australia, South Africa, England, and France, Jews primarily go to Orthodox synagogues. I have a beautiful granddaughter in Australia. And all the synagogues, except one or two in Melbourne, are Orthodox. And the people who go, they go there. They may not be fully observant, but that's where they choose to go. So the Israeli is now becoming more traditional, number one. Number two, things that Rabbi Kanevsky is saying is also very true. Some of them do not find that sense of identification. But the truth of the matter is, on the ground, which is really what we're talking about, if you look at secular Tel Aviv, 450, 500,000 people, 550 Orthodox synagogues and one Reform temple. People vote with their feet, and the average Israeli is voting with their feet. So I see a tremendous renewal of Judaism in Israel, but for a lot of them, they're dabblers. They'll go Friday night to services and Shabbos afternoon to the beach. They'll keep kosher in Tel Aviv, but they'll go to the buffet in Las Vegas. This is the Israeli. He's like the economy between these different things. But the Judaism he chooses to go to, and you find this even here in Southern California, Israelis tend to go to more traditional congregations, even if they're not that religious. And I think that we're going to see the continuation of that trend in Israel. Also, we're seeing something else. If you look at the statistics, almost 25% of Israelis, 22, 23%, are self-identified as Orthodox observants. Another 35% are traditional but not so religious. And then we have not religious but not anti-religious, and a small position that are anti-religious. So we're seeing a certain kind of shift in society toward greater religiosity, greater sense of tradition, and if the liberal movements in Israel want to gain support, they have to do what they need to do in other countries, Australia, South Africa, whatever, is go on the ground and enlist that support. But right now, beyond the American immigrants, they've had a marginal amount in Tel Aviv that they haven't been able to gain so much. But I think that most of those Israelis looking for tradition are finding it with a dabbling in Orthodoxy. And that's what I think they do. That's the statistics, I think, bear that out.
Rabbi Elizabeth,
I find that when I have conversations with my Israeli friends, they're actually unaware of Masorti shuls, Masorti synagogues, and I actually think it's our fault. I think it's our responsibility as Americans to start, as I was referencing before, the PR campaign. Masorti Judaism is vibrant and exciting in Israel, with hundreds of shuls around the country. And what I'm sad to say is that when I speak with my friends who are Masorti rabbis, that's not actually their title. Their title is often PE teacher or secretary, because that's how they're making their living, and rabbi is third. And so when you have a Masorti rabbi who has very little funding, is unable to make a name for themselves, to get out in the community and meet these unaffiliated Israelis or Israelis that say they're traditional, then what are they supposed to do? They're fighting an uphill battle.
Consul General.
Just add to that. We live in a, Myra and myself, Myra's over there, my wife, we live in a small community in Mountain Jerusalem. It's a very interesting community. Let's talk about real life. So we have many Orthodox congregations there. There's a Reform congregation there. The Reform congregation just let go of the rabbi because there's no funding. They shut down the school because there's no funding. So yes, there's a debate about whether the state should fund this and all that. Eventually we'll work it out. But while we're working that out, where is North America? Where is it now? The word Masorti was also an innovation in Israel, because at first it really was a foreign word. It was conservativi or reformi. No one understood what that was. The big debate in the movement in the 70s was, how do we market ourselves? And the term Masorti was actually a term that my father, my late father, fought very hard for, and he had a lot of opposition to even what to name the movement in Israel. But I think, just to disagree a little bit, in recent years, certainly in recent decades, the two movements, both Reform and Conservative, today are led by Israeli rabbis in Israel. They have nativized, they have become part of the tapestry of the creativity that takes place in Israel, from the arts to cinema and to Jewish life. So I think you're right also that the silent majority in Israel are neither. If they come from Sephardi backgrounds, they do exactly that. They go to shul Friday night, they get in the car, they take their kids because they want to spend time with their parents, in the bigger city, and do kiddush there. They'll wake up in the morning, they'll usually go to shul, and then they'll go and do soccer on the beach in the afternoon. That's the silent majority. What are they? Are they religious? Are they secular? They themselves don't know. But what we do know is that there's tremendous movement in Israel to all sorts, to orthodoxy, but also going back into reinterpreting within orthodoxy. There's the Gesher rabbis and the Zohar rabbis, and so much going on, even in the Orthodox world. And as I said, Amsalim, his whole approach is to go back to the old Moroccan, Sephardi traditions of tolerance before they even came to Israel. Because in Israel they changed, they went through the Lita'im process. They went through the Eastern European jury process. It's very different from their own tradition. So you're seeing a constant seeking in Israel of tradition, of ancient music, of fusing with modern music. There's so much movement that I urge all of you to be part of. My second comment, and I do want to connect to something that you said, Rabbi, which is important. Look, Jews in Israel have come from, some say 100 countries, some say 70 countries, many different backgrounds. Now, if I just take the extreme, if I go to the Ethiopian Jewish community, they have been disconnected from the Jewish mainstream for most of history. When they came to Israel, first of all, they didn't even know that there was an Israel. They thought they were going to Jerusalem. They didn't even know that there was a modern state. They didn't celebrate Hanukkah or Purim. They have been separated from the mainstream of Judaism for that many years that they didn't even know about these holidays. How would they know about Reform and Conservative Judaism? So when you think about all the ethnic groups in Israel, people from Sephardi traditions, people from other countries that don't share the tradition of a bat mitzvah, having a talis on, this is a classic clash of cultures, and it takes time for a culture to accommodate change like that. And I think it's reflected also in the law and in the courts. So you're seeing a slow but steady process that is changing things. Again, back to Anan Hoffman. If every month they go and they challenge the law, because the law passed in 67 and the regulations that were passed in the early 80s say that the way you pray there is based on a local practice as determined by the rabbi of the kotel, right or wrong, change it to legislation. If you change it to civil disobedience, there is a chance that through the clash of rights in any democracy, the police will come in and intervene. This is what we're seeing. It's month after month. Now there's another question here. If you believe in liberal democracy, yet you're defying the law rather than changing it, Well, what does that mean about everyone else? What about extremists from a certain political view that doesn't recognize a certain law and also defies the law? So Israel sort of caught, the state authorities are caught in between these competing claims for that sacred space. And again, we're not going to resolve it tonight. It's going to be a long process of education, commitment, starting with the local rabbi, the local Masorti community, and making sure that those schools are funded, and making sure that Israelis are educated about other forms of Judaism that they've never been exposed to. And eventually, through the process of the courts and through the legislative process, you can change the law. Now, the woman of the Kotel issue is simply not a resonating issue in Israel. There was a survey done of women in Israel before the elections that are coming on January 22nd, and this issue wasn't even mentioned. Other issues of synagogue and state were mentioned, civil marriage, other issues, or even the military. This issue simply is not even on people's radar screen. So we need to understand that it's a complex, sensitive reality that we need to work through. What we're trying to do is convey your voice to our headquarters and to make sure that every Rosh Chodesh, we have people on the ground to try, and some people here know what I'm talking about, to try to work through that process, because we believe, again, that your connection to Israel is very important. And we have to overcome these clashes of cultures, and we have to overcome all of these challenges in modern Jewish life. But it's not going to be done from today to tomorrow.
I just wanted to bring in Chef Roseman, who's the other. Are you a rabbi? You're not a rabbi, right? You're a lawyer. I was thinking I was really out of but you are a lawyer, you're an observant Jew. Do you think it's unreasonable for American Jews to expect Israel, which is a Jewish state, to have the same kinds of religious freedoms that, say, a liberal democracy like America has?
It's a great question. Their constitution is, they do not have a constitution, so the entire legal structure is different. And in this way, it is, you're right, unreasonable for us to expect them to have certain sets of freedoms that we have, because the premise is entirely different. It's also that much more complicated because their legal system is constructed of layers. It's not just in the United States. You have statutes, you have a constitution, you have statutes, and you have case law. In Israel, you have to often refer not only to Israeli law, but to British law and Turkish law and rabbinic law. So the layers of complexity that are involved in the Israeli legal system just don't apply here. But the same layers of multiculturalism that require subtlety in dealing with people of different denominations, different culture, you have it in spades there. And so in that way, the American community can comment on it, but not from a legal perspective per se.
Yes, Laura.
I agree with Rabbi Kanevsky that change will really happen when Israelis want things to change. But I do want to remind everybody that Anat Hoffman is that Israeli. She was born in Israel, she, educated here at UCLA, she has lived in Israel, and when she prays at the wall, she's really praying. This is something that is real for her, it's not an act of provocation. So I think that it's important to publicly acknowledge that.
I would just like to add how important it is for us to continue to reach out and make this bridge. This summer I had a wonderful thing happen. I was on the Hartman study program, and we turned around to introduce ourselves to the people sitting around us. And the lovely young woman in back of me, middle-aged woman, I'm a middle-aged woman, looked just like me, said, my name is Miri. I said, really? Mary what? And she said, Mary Rowland. And we started to talk, and we decided to put an evening together where rabbis that were women rabbis on the Hartman met with women rabbis in Israel. And we crammed into a cultural center room where we sat on the floor on little mattresses. It was a very Israeli event. And one by one, these Israeli women began to talk about both their challenges and their successes. It wasn't like there were only 3 people and they just showed up at the wall every once in a while. And I was impressed by the fact that Rabbi Gold knew that time is necessary and patience is necessary. She's been a rabbi in a regional area, been the spiritual director of her kibbutz for a long time till this lawsuit happened. And I go back and forth pretty often. And when I first went to Israel when I was 17 years old, I had come from a very secular family in Israel. And they heard later on that I'd become a rabbi, they were aghast. Right. Have you come? I mean, that was 20 years ago. Now, they really want to know that their children's children will receive a Jewish education that is not the Judaism they ran away from, but that it has tradition and meaning. They've actually turned to me to help guide them in that way and find rabbis for them in Israel, which I have. But there was a Shabbat on the beach that started 5 years ago in Tel Aviv, maybe 15 people. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Israelis come, right? Now, this is Israel, so they may daven in an Orthodox shul and then come to Shabbat on the beach. Or there's a fence, and they stand by the fence. We don't actually go to where the event is happening. I don't do synagogue, but I do like stand on the other side of the fence. Everybody finds their place. Back to what has been said both by Rabbi Kanevsky and certainly by the Consul General. Change is inevitable but slow. And Judaism really, Mordechai Kaplan was right. Judaism is the evolving civilization. We do not sacrifice animals at the wall, no matter what King Solomon did.
I just wanted to ask the Consul General and Rabbi Guzik, who talked about, in terms of change, sending money, funding, and supporting the movements over there. But I wonder what Rabbi Levy is talking about and others, that there seems to be a more indigenous Israeli form of Judaism that's building, that's growing. At the same time that even in America, the standard movements, Reform, Conservative, Constructionist, Orthodox, those labels being less and less here, why should we be so concerned about funding them over there? Maybe the next generation doesn't really want those labels, want those structures.
Because whether it's called reform or Mitkademet or conservative or Masorti or a think tank that is dealing with the critical issues of Jewish identity in modern life, it's all one, it's basically one tapestry, it's one continuum. If you want to bring change in a structure, and think about last summer, think about the socioeconomic demonstrations in Tel Aviv. There is a very, very vibrant civil society in Israel working on change in all sorts of levels of life. And it's actually very exciting because people are taking ownership over their citizenship in Israel, whether it's Kaddish prices or the way you practice Judaism. In the older Israel that I remember growing up, the religious life was left to the religious. Secular was ideologically secular. This is part of the problem. When Israel was recreated in 48, it was a very heavy hand of a socialist, secular, which after the Holocaust, when those remnants of religious Judaism came to Israel and wanted to recreate themselves, they were actually threatened by the Jewish state at the time. So we need to understand the background to all of this.
It happened to be what it is because it seems to be forgotten that the very decision of who would control the law was a political decision in 1967, and the fight between labor, the Ministry of Interior, and the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and Ben-Gurion and company made a political decision.
Consul General, you want to talk to the history of that? Of the Mechitza at the wall, if it didn't exist before, then...
Well, there was a Mechitza before also. It during the British and Turkish rule, the Mechitza was put up, the Turks would tear it down sometimes, the Jews would put it back up, the British would tear it down sometimes. A friend of mine was arrested for blowing the shofar at the wall in the 1930s and went to prison numerous times for that. The tradition was, historically, that men and women always prayed separate in the Temple Mount from the time of King Solomon. That's a historical fact. And again, there was a historical compromise made here, where two sections of the wall were set up. So therefore, and the Orthodox have not interfered with the non-traditional prayer done by the non-Orthodox, even though the non-Orthodox may not be so happy with the locale, etc., but the Orthodox have followed the compromise. I think that's itself interesting. And the fact of the matter is that there's a strong Israeli consensus, I think, for traditional prayer. The majority of Jews in Israel go to Orthodox synagogues. That's where they choose to go. If you count membership the way you do in America, you go to shul at least once a year and give a few dollars. I mean, 60-70% of the population, when they go to shul Yom Kippur, they choose an Orthodox synagogue. That's where they go. And so therefore, that was the consensus. There is now a formal chief rabbi of the wall, who's also chief rabbi of the other holy places. And I want to state what I said before, is I spoke to him a few weeks ago, and he told me there's many religious Orthodox groups who want to do religious events at the wall. He doesn't allow them to do it either. It's not just and not optimal. There's a lot of other stuff, but they're not getting arrested every other week.
If I could just add to your question, it is a political decision. It is a decision by the Knesset, by the Parliament, and political decisions can change.
I had the fortunate experience of spending about half my time in Israel. I can tell you can fill that sheet twice.
Can you introduce yourself?
Did you hear him? Okay, just speak right into the mic.
Sorry, identify myself?
Yes.
Yeah.
My name's Larry Weinman. I blog sometimes in the Jewish Journal.
Just speak very well.
Hello?
Yeah.
Better?
Close.
Hi, my name's Larry Weinman. I blog on the Jewish Journal. I've met with probably half of these people. I've davened with them. I've learned with them. I've spent chagim with them. I can tell you the least thing they care about is whether they're called Orthodox, Conservative, or Reform. They receive here, hardly anyone knows about them. They get no funding from the movements because they're not part of a movement. The rabbinical students that come from the various movements don't interact with them. I'll stop from the podium and just ask why you think that is.
Repeat the question.
He asked why the panel thinks it is that a lot of these groups, or many of these groups that are working for religious pluralism in Israel from all different streams, why they don't receive funding from America, why American Jews haven't heard of them, why they don't support that other groups do.
I don't really know the answer to the question. I think that we have our own categories and we have our own boxes, and we invariably try to understand other parts of the world, especially parts of the world that we think we should understand, in terms of our own categories and our own boxes. And it's hard for us to understand it when they don't fit into our own categories in our own boxes, and that's why we're just learning now what's really happening in Israel. I do also think, and I'm not sure I'm disagreeing with Rabbi Eliezer, though I'm sure if I am, you will tell me.
There's 2 houses down for my grandchildren. I got to watch it.
That I think to imagine that the return to more interest in tradition in Israel is going to translate into a return to orthodoxy is wrong. And the reason I think that is that orthodoxy is too difficult in many different ways for modern people. It is too difficult in the sense that there are things that we are required to believe relative to the divinity of Torah, for example, that are very difficult for people, they're very difficult for modern people. There are things that we believe about gender that are very difficult for modern people to believe. One of the staples of modern society is that we don't distinguish or discriminate between genders. There are things, and this is the next emerging issue, clearly, there are things about sexual preference that moderns are going to, or increasingly finding it very difficult to believe and accept. I'm an Orthodox rabbi. My family, my children, are Orthodox Jews, and we have found a way to integrate all of the things that Orthodoxy requires into our belief system and into our lives as modern people and modern Jews, but I fully recognize that it's very, very difficult. This community, this city is filled with people who I think would be wonderful fits for our show. But I know that's not possible. There are too many things that are difficult. And I think that this is only more true within Israeli society as well. And it's important to recognize that these are two different things. A return to orthodoxy is one thing, that's a Baal Tshuva movement, and we're aware of that. And this re-embrace of tradition and learning and Jewish literature and Talmud study is something else. It's not a return to orthodoxy. It is the creation of an Israeli Judaism.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Sue Hockford, and I'm chairman of the board of overseers of the Hebrew Union College, Los Angeles. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm also the mother of a female rabbi and the mother-in-law of a male rabbi in Nashville, Tennessee. So I have a little bit of history in all of this. But my question actually is probably to Rabbi Eliezer, because as chairman of the board and as executive governor of the board of governors of the Hebrew Union College, we just, a week ago Thursday, ordained 10 rabbis in Israel for Israel. Now I would say 9 were for...
I didn't turn it off.
I didn't turn it off.
I'll talk about it. 9 are for Israel.
9 of the rabbis and the 10 are for Israel. The 10th one actually is for South America, and we're really proud of that. So I'm having a little problem understanding when you say that most of the Israelis are turning to Orthodoxy, because that's not what I'm finding, that's not what I'm finding in my trips there. I'm really delighted that we have, as you said, the government has finally recognized to fund somebody outside the Orthodox movement, and I think we're making great strides there, and I think I'd like you to address
I agree
that.
that there is growth and reform in Israel, but at the same time, if you look at the studies, and I'll be glad to take you to maybe parts of Israel you haven't been to. We can go on a tour together, that could be a very experience. But the fact of the matter is, I disagree with Rabbi Kadevsky, which is not surprising. That I think that many of the people that are engaging in a more traditional kind of context. The question is what's going on also within Orthodoxy, which is we see a great diversity. We see on one level the more hardline Lithuanian style of traditional Orthodoxy, which is much more insular. I come from a different end of the community where I deal 98% of the time. I live in Orange County, which you believe Yorba Linda, Richard Nixon's buried just down the block.
I didn't know he was Jewish.
Well, no, Romney asked me to pray for him, it didn't work. You know, Romney asked me to pray, it was great, but it didn't work. But seriously speaking, and I deal 98% of my time with Jews that you would define as not Orthodox. I have a whole beautiful congregation full of such people. So how they self-define themselves is very interesting. So I think what's happening, number one, in Israel is that many of the Jews who are getting more involved in tradition, they're dabbling in the more traditional end of the community, but as Rabbi Kadevsky also said correctly, they're not buying the whole kit and caboodle. They may say, I disagree with this, and I agree with that. I don't fully agree with that, but they're also finding a lot of that identity expression within the traditional. And parts of Orthodoxy in Israel is not so-called, in the Haredi world, we're going through very interesting changes. On one level, we're seeing the opening up of people working, which is a very important thing. We're beginning to see people go to the army. I come from a part of the Haredi world, Chabad, where our young men do go to the army, and many of my classmates in Israel did go to the army. One of my classmates who sat at my table was killed in the Yom Kippur War. But there is a certain shift now within the more traditional Jewish world in Israel because it's reached a much larger number. And also here in the United States, if you look at the recent Jewish demographic survey in New York, the numbers of Orthodox Jews are much higher.
That's a different panel.
That's a different panel discussion. But I do feel that tradition, that people are integrated with Orthodoxy, reform may be growing, but I think a lot of those people becoming more observant are becoming partially Orthodox, to put it that way.
Yes, sir.
This one you'll probably find a bit easier. Do you have any written material about all this that you're talking about? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Because especially Consul General Siegel talking about all those organizations, I'd like to know more about them. I don't read Hebrew very well.
Okay. why don't you give the name of the website? It's Panim.
Panim, P-A-N-I-M. Just look up Google Panim Israel. It will be your second entry. And you can get that graphic, and when you click on every image, you'll get a link to the actual site with all a wealth of information, which is endless about what these groups do.
And I can just put in a plug here. Rabbi Kaminsky has a site on our website, jewishjournal.com, called Orthodoxy, which really deals in a very deep and smart and sensitive way with a lot of these issues. And Larry Weinman, who spoke here, has a site that deals lots with religious pluralism in Israel, blog on our website, jewishjournal.com. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Spike Anderson, one of the rabbis over at Stephen West Temple. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you fine people. It's nice that we can have this conversation. So, I do appreciate hearing multiple sides of the argument regarding Hoffman and the wall, and I appreciate the cogent presentation and how different compromises are made in ways that perhaps we didn't realize before from an Orthodox point of view. I guess what really has bothered me about this, I feel like we've been hearing about Mme. Hoffman getting arrested for doing this for a while, so she's no stranger to the wall, and she's no stranger to this action, whether it's because she feels it in her neshama or because there's some PR and fundraising that comes with this. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. It probably is all there. But when I hear reports that she's strip searched after being arrested, and I would highly doubt that the rabbis who are coming from other sections and trying to hold their tables in the middle of the kotel being strip searched after they're brought away. I mean, this is not addressed to Rabbi Eshman, by the way. This is disgusting. And so what I would hope is that, here we are, it's interesting, here we are, a community full of, here we have community leaders, and talking about something that is clear from the experts that Israelis themselves don't particularly care about, that being women praying at the wall, at least not in large numbers.
A question?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Question being...
I know.
The question being, do you think that what we are doing here tonight and this type of thing may alert the authorities at the Kotel that she ought to be treated with more respect going forward because we are paying attention? I guess that's my question. Thank you for that.
I think we can all agree that what happened was unacceptable and it's being investigated, and people in this room know how hard we are pushing as the consulate in Los Angeles to be your voice to our headquarters. This is the second or third month that we've been very intensively involved in what's happening, including, again, having people on the ground, educating the police, speaking to the rabbi of the Kotel, trying to ensure that as this occurs every month, and it will occur every month, that it's handled in the best way that we can achieve, and that these kind of things don't happen again.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. My name is Richard Levick, founder of Levite Line and LeviteLine.com, a 501c3 now. And I am a former Jew, and I identify as Levite. So I am called to pray for Israel, and I do.
Okay, any questions?
My question, a couple of quick questions. Rabbi Eliezer says since King Solomon, men and women have been separate. Are you aware that this temple of Solomon was destroyed, as was the second temple? Therefore, I see a connection between the traditions, the man-made traditions, and results.
Okay.
Do you see that question? The second question is, Ms. Levy said, we do not sacrifice animals anymore. So instead, 6 million people got sacrificed. Is that your preference?
Thank you.
It's a fact history. I'm sorry if it offends, the truth offends.
I'll stay away. Just a question. Rabbi Eliezer, what he's saying is a good point. There's been lots of changes over the years in Jewish life. Why?
Again, we have a theological debate, and this is really the core of all this. And I came tonight, even though I knew that I would be in the minority, because I have a lot of respect for Roy Geller. We met each other a few months ago, and I felt it was important to express a different kind of view. There is a classical view of Judaism which resists change, which that on Mount Sinai, God gave the Torah, the rules and regulations, and we've been following the same thing ever since. And there's the modern movements that started in the last 250 years that have come with an evolutionary view. It's a big theological gap. We do not agree. That's the core of the issue here tonight. And the reason I came is I felt there's something that connects us together as Jews. And I want to tell you a 2-second story. My friend over here doesn't kill me. Is that there was an old, and this is really the core of what tonight's all about. There was an old Jew who lived in a little shtetl, a European town, and the local poritz, the rich man, called him in and says, Yankel, I got big news for you. There's going to be a big show, a big marketplace, and I need a bear, and I couldn't catch a bear, so I'm making you into the bear. So the big show comes, and Yankel learns how to act like a bear, and he's in the cage, and he's roaring and tummeling, and suddenly, and the other side of the cage is another bear, and he figures, oy vey, when he realizes I ain't no bear, what's going to happen? And so the other bear begins to walk near our little Jew Yankel, and Yankel, what does a good Jewish bear do? He puts his paw in his eyes, and he says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and the other bear answers, Baruch Shem Kavod. The point is like this. We have theological differences, and to be honest, they're irreconcilable. I'm not going to agree. I believe in the classic view of Judaism, and that Torah was given on Mount Sinai. And I will not believe in the evolutionary changes that the Reform and Conservative movements made. However, we have a common destiny as Jews. And even though we disagree, and we profoundly disagree, and I'm not going to minimize that, and we have a common responsibility to help and support Israel. So, I agree with the Universal Report, which I wrote about in the Jerusalem Post. Rob didn't publish the piece. I had to give it to the Jerusalem Post. I'm trying to plug, you know what I mean? And the fact is, I don't agree with a lot. I didn't agree with the disengagement, which brought around the disaster we had. But at the same time, what I believe we have to stress here in America, with all due respect to Emanuel Hoffman, is not the issues we disagree with, but the issues that we do agree with. Because our support to Israel is imperative. And I came here tonight, even though I knew I'd be in the minority, because I have respect for Rabbi Geller, and I felt this was an important place to air this, but there's something that connects every one of us in this room together, which is more important than our differences, and really, and our connection to Israel, especially at a time where Rahman al-Islam, when God forbid, when poor Miri Sharf, a 26-year-old Chabad educator, plus the other 4 people that were killed, a pregnant woman who came from India to visit her family and have a child, was killed by a missile from Gaza, we know it's really important. So we disagree, but we have to learn to live together.
Hi, my name is Helen Grossman. I'm 22 years old, and 2 years ago I stood with Emanuel Hoffman at the Western Wall and prayed with her. And it was the most life-changing event in my short life, but I want to say that it changed my life fundamentally and challenged who I was, and I haven't been the same since. And I want to ask you how you as rabbis and as educators and as representatives of the government that just arrested her, how do you explain to people why we should care about Israel and why we should love Israel when this is happening? I love Israel. I grew up, like many people here, believing that Israel was a safe and wonderful home for all Jews. And also that as a woman, I could accomplish anything I wanted to do. So how do you reconcile those? And how would you tell people, how do you respond to people when they ask you about that?
Who wants to take it first? Robert, can I? But let's do this as kind of a lightning round.
Yeah, we'll try to be as quick as we can. Although the questions are very deep. Look, first of all, the role of women in Israel, I don't think Israel has anything to be ashamed of. We had a prime minister, we had the chief of the Supreme Court, we have the leaders of the opposition, of many political parties, of institutions, liberal and otherwise, of hospitals, of universities. I think women in Israel are doing just fine. There are challenges that we obviously have in a multicultural society that we have to deal with. So I think there are many, many heroes, including in this coalition. Women that are fighting for change in Israel that you can be inspired by. And it could be Emanuel Hoffman is one, but it's one out of a whole group of people that are bringing change. And I appreciate your experience. And I think we should, this is why we're here tonight, is to talk about change in Israel, the way that's done. Yes, we're very unhappy about the way this was handled last month, and we're trying to change that. That being said, there is a law. police has to deal with, again, we're going back to Temple Mount. Think about what happened that day. The police were dealing with Anat Hoffman. They were dealing with people that were trying to go up to Temple Mount that were not allowed to, so they were arrested that same night. They have people from all walks of life that they're dealing with. What they're trying to do is enforce the legislation in place. Now, to change that, it's a process that we're discussing tonight, and I hope it's an inspiring process. Things can change, things are changing all the time in Israel.
The state of Israel is the greatest project that the Jewish people has embarked on in the last almost 3,000 years. And we believe, all of us, I think, believe, that as much as individuals we can make a difference in the world, that as a people we can transform the world. And being Jewish is about believing that the Jewish people can do this, and the Jewish people, these days and with God's help forevermore, is the state of Israel. If you want to be a part of Jewish destiny, if you want to be a part of Jewish transformation of the world, Tikkun, it's via Medinat Israel. It's just the way it is.
And the point is to be engaged. And you were. I've known you since you were even younger than you are. I know what it meant for you to go to Israel, and I know what that transformation was like for you, that you reconnected with Judaism by reconnecting with Israel, with your love for Israel and your ability to be critical of the parts of Israel that you find need to be changed. And I think that is the project, to stay engaged with Israel and to believe that change is possible. You know that it is, and that's why you're involved in the work that you are involved with, and that's why you're here today.
Helen, the land of Israel is God's gift to the Jewish people. It transcends everything else. It's the very core of our identity together with Torah. It's the core of your identity, it's the core of my identity. And we may disagree about certain things, but this is a divine gift that we all have to cherish, that we have to hold in trust, and realize that it was something given to the Jewish people, for the coming of Mashiach. So it's something that you may have a disagreement over something specific. It transcends all those disagreements. It is a special, unique gift from above for every one of us in this room, and every one of the Jewish people throughout history, and we can never forget that.
My name is Penny Herman. I engage in Jewish demography, and my question, which I'll lead up to, has to do a little bit with the topic that Consul Siegel mentioned. He used to do daily denominational shifting, and I studied.
Get to the question, Penny.
Okay.
Frank, the question.
The question, well, in essence, Israel has done, the Central Bureau of Statistics has done research on denominational shifting, and as Rabbi Kanievsky says, it's hard to be Orthodox, and the shift is really to non-Orthodox, ultimately. It's the Central Bureau of Statistics, there's data. But my question is, with regard to, there's another aspect of polling, the law in Israel basically says that anybody who insults or hurts the that's when the police is called. When it's not that there's one rabbi or the rabbi at the wall. The rabbi at the wall can't see over the mikvah. What often happens, as Tom has explained, is okay. My question is why women who are ultra-Orthodox and notify the rabbi of the wall don't have a greater communication with women who are non-Orthodox. There's, in essence, the dynamic is that...
Okay, I gotta get you off. Does anybody want to talk about this process here?
how women are connected. I want to go back to Helen, who was standing there. And Helen's sneakers on the ground are really how they're connected. And so it is not a question of who makes a phone call. People live, whereas you know, demographic bubbles. But every person in this room, I believe, has been in Israel, or you wouldn't be in here tonight. And in your process of being there, you make a personal connection. So those women, when Helen goes, she meets people and maybe goes to Shabbat Shigra. Shabbat Shigra, Orthodox, right? There's a pizza down the middle. Only it's very small and women can sing. Shira Chadashah, Shira Chadashah. And the change then happens across those borders. Shira Chadashah started 5, 6, 7 years ago, not more than that, Tova Hartman. And I don't know, it could be longer. It is a large group of men and women praying together, and women's voices are heard. It spreads. Hundreds of people come now. So the people who are going to make the phone call, of course there's going to be an ultra-Orthodox woman who's going to be offended, or there's going to be, look, we have a range. But the more everybody in this room visits and goes and participates and lets their kids go and doesn't cancel when something happens and they decide not to go on that trip, change happens.
I wanted to throw in another question, and maybe Chef, you can answer this, and then some other people on the panel. If you really start to see this change happening, and you start to see the changes even at the legal level where they really have to happen for them to take effect, do you worry that the very Jewish character of Israel, the Jewish character of the Jewish state, will be legislated away? If you Ben-Gurion, when he instituted these laws, said that if you don't go for the strictest interpretation of Jewish law in civil life, you will split the house of Israel in two. Is that a legitimate worry? Or, and it goes back to something Rabbi Kanevsky said about continuity.
I think that people are always going to worry about the slippery slope.
Right.
And so it goes to the issue of what limits you place in whichever direction you're going. And to the flip side of Rabbi Halevi's response to your question, you have to recognize that even if any of us wants change to go in one direction or the other, there are going to be limitations that can't happen. So in the context of Anat Hoffman, we're talking about women's position in a public space. It's very different than what happens in a private space, where the government is not legislating how women are dealing with their talitot or their tefillin and leading a service in a private area. But in this particular context, there's a history to overcome, there are cultural issues to overcome, and part of effecting change in any of these contexts is understanding the limitations, understanding the sensitivities of whoever is on the other side of your position, either way.
There's another element in the room, and that is the issue of Zionism. We have to understand that the Haredi parties and individuals are wonderful, passionate, serious, self-sacrificing Jews. But they're not Zionists. And if you are not a Zionist, you are not invested in the flowering of the state, qua the state. And if you're not invested in that, and all that you're invested in is your religious doctrine, and I'm not saying that that's a negative thing. We should be invested, all of us should be invested deeply in our religious doctrines. But if you don't have the Zionist piece, all of the tendencies to want to see people coming together and people being an integrated society, you don't have those desires, you don't have that point of view, and it's a whole other thing.
I just to give you, share with you a little bit of that. So, when Golda Meir was the prime minister, and we instituted state television for the first time. So the big debate in 1967 was, would there be television on Shabbat or not? Okay, so you know that what did the government decide? Does anyone know what Golda decided? No TV on Shabbat. It went to the Supreme Court, it was overturned. Now turn on your TVs in Israel, not on Shabbat. And you will find that there are 600 satellite stations coming from all over. It's not even a matter of discussion anymore. So the country changes, society changes, the laws change, sensibilities change. Today, many places of culture open on Shabbat. And it's not even an issue anymore. I mean, it may not be liked by certain elements in Israel, but the public space in Israel has changed progressively over the years on countless things, and even the private space. Civil marriage today, if it's not allowed in Israel, then you have twice as many Israelis going to Cyprus to get married now than a decade ago. It's just reality. So we need to look at how society is changing and see how the laws and this discussion fits the changes that we see, both in this community here and in the community.
We're going to get to the question.
Hi everyone, my name is Maya Paley. I'm with the National Council of Jewish Women in LA, and I also have a blog with the Jewish Journal. It's called Women Rights.
Does anybody here not?
I'm also the founder of this coalition advocating for African asylum seekers called Right Now. So a lot of you would probably have interacted with me in some way. Two questions. One is I'm getting mixed messages about our role as American Jews. What I'm hearing is Consul General Siegel saying we have to give money, we have to support his organizations. But I'm also hearing, wait, the process is slow, change will happen. Do we or do we not, as American Jews who are donating tons of money, who are super engaged in Israel's future, do we or do we not have a right to ask Israel, to ask the government, and to advocate for women's rights, for equal rights, for democracy, and for freedom? I want that answer very straightforward. My second question is, what would be so wrong, and I might get a lot of, I don't know, anger from people, but what would be so bad about the separation in Israel between temple and state? Right now, we're in a situation where a lot of women aren't able to get a divorce because the rabbis are the men who sign on to give them. I have aunts in my family who are not able to get a divorce from abusive husbands. So what would be so wrong with doing that? For me personally, I feel like it will maintain the Jewish values and the Jewish culture in that country.
Thank you. Rabbi Eliezer, what would be the harm?
The harm was the very core of Israel and the Zionist enterprise, its connection to Judaism. And if you sever religion from state, even though like anything else, try going to the DMV, it's not a very pleasant experience. And you can have also religious institutions that are state institutions in Israel, which also can be not a very pleasant experience. But there's also a tremendous amount of committed, wonderful people in the religious world who try their best to be good rabbis and run a good rabbinate. So I think severing religion from state. Secondly, it's not going to happen politically. We have to face that reality.
But finish the first, you think it would be
I think it would undermine the very core of Jewish identity, which is at the very essence of what the idea of a Jewish state is all about. And therefore, it would be a very weakening of the whole core of the identity of the modern state of Israel. You can't, the American model, we as Americans, and I realize this as both an American and as a person who lived in Israel for 5 years, we see things within the American context. We think maybe it should be like that over there. Well, things are different there. And I don't think the majority of Jews in Israel would go for such a separation of those two things. It's something that American Jews maybe want to impose on it because they want to see the country a certain way. I also wanted to say one other point about the Haredi world, which is important to understand, or everything else you mentioned. The Haredi world is going through tectonic shifts right now. The Haredi world, basically, the question was, how do we deal with a secular Zionistic state in 1948? And they said that a state that in many times was waging a war against classical Jewish values, because the socialistic Zionism in 1948 is not the traditional Jewish Zionism. You know, when you saw Bibi Netanyahu, he recently made, I watched 2 speeches that he made recently at the conventions in America. Behind him was the Code of Jewish Law. And Ben-Gurion didn't have the Code of Jewish Law behind him. Until Ben-Achim Begin, there wasn't the mezuzah on the office of the Prime Minister. So there's a big change going on. So the Haredi world said, parts of the Haredi world said, step back, I want nothing to do with the secular Zionists. Other parts of the Haredi world, my part of the Haredi world, said, we don't like everything about it, but we're going to be involved with society. The modern Orthodox world, the religious Zionist world said, we want to be active partners with that society. Now that segment of the Haredi world that stepped back is beginning to step forward. And what we need to do is encourage encourage the integration, and I'm not using the word ultra-Orthodox intentionally, as I mentioned before, it's an offensive word, of the traditional Orthodox community into the mainstream society with respect, just like we need to have an integration of the mainstream society with the respect of more traditionally Orthodox. And we need to find a compromise in this issue. We need things like Nahal Haredi, like the arrangements of the Air Force, and other things like this, to encourage this segment of the Haredi world to step back, to step forward, and be more engaged with the broader society. We're seeing the beginnings of this right now. My segment of the community is very engaged with the broader society, and I think we need to encourage this more.
Can I just say that the majority of Israelis favor civil marriage. I do think it is possible to separate temple and state and keep the Jewish sense that Israel is Jewish.
Consul General, let's talk about civil marriage, because these are, we talked about the wall a lot. Some of these are extremely serious issues, like civil marriage. We created a story in the Jewish journal about a woman who couldn't be a soldier. She died, she couldn't be buried in the Jewish graveyard, because the rabbi wouldn't recognize her as Jewish, she was from Russia. And many other things, the get issue. But these are serious issues. How will they change in Israeli society? And these aren't necessarily things that should wait to come from the ground up that you're talking about.
Well, actually, these are the main issues that these organizations are dealing with, as opposed to the prayer arrangements at the wall. The major issues that are of concern of the women as they're polled before the elections are on those personal status issues that you were referring to. So there's tremendous grassroots pressure in Israel today to change many of these things. And just to answer your question, I think first of all, this is not a schnorr for these organizations in any way. This is an invitation to you to get to know what is happening in Israel, not just in the politics, but in the people. What is happening in Israel, and you know this from the immigration issue, all the NGOs that are working on doing this day and night on the ground, it's being done the same way on women's issues, on minority issues, on a whole host of issues in the complicated democracy decision.
Yes, sir. Let's get a couple more questions because we're running low on time.
My name is Eddie Eshman, I'm representing Temple, and as a member of Men's Club, I've been involved in raising funds for various causes in Israel. So Consul General, you asked us to support these 60 organizations. And what I'm wondering is there a need for 60 organizations to do religious pluralism in Israel? Are they actually interfering with each other? I mean, I'm just thinking about the logo that they created here. How many thousands of dollars it costs to do that? Is there a way to really focus and get something done rather than different organizations?
It does come from a member of Senate. I would recommend $1 to each organization. Yeah. Again, this is an invitation to you to be aware of something that you may not have known. It used to be like in the old days when we said that Israel's a startup nation and no one knew what we were talking about. Well, now people do know what we're talking about because most of the community focuses on those headlines that we wake up in the morning and we fire up those computers, we look at the New York Times or we look at Haaretz in English or whatever we look at, and we don't see any of this. You have to know where to look. You need to be an active learner or teacher to understand what this means and how significant it is. If Israelis today are being polled, and 500,000 Israelis, which is almost 10% of the Jewish population, are saying to you that we believe in this coalition and their message, which includes Masorti and reform and all these things, it means that things have changed in Israel, at least from the days when I was a kid and there were two. So it's just a fact that these organizations are significant and they're growing in stature and they're running in the coming elections. And there are hundreds and hundreds of people that are what we call the mitpakdim. They're joining the political parties. Look at Likud today. They just had their convention. They just made a series of decisions. 60% of the people voted. You know that 40% could be people in this room. So there are ways of being involved politically in Israel. Again, it's an invitation to you not to just say, oh, you're involved, and I'm Hoffman again, but to realize that all of Israeli society is open to you, not to fund, but to know that they exist, to visit them, to be inspired by what they're trying to do in the grassroots change that's taking place in Israel from the bottom up as well.
Okay, last two questions. Yes, ma'am.
You were before me.
Okay, so I drove down here from Thousand Oaks, right before I first want to say thank you to the two Orthodox rabbis who came. I think it was for the organizers to have you representatives, and we do appreciate that. I just wanted to say, as someone who's very involved in the free speech movement, and the women's movement, and all those movements, how personally insulting it was, just on the emotional level, to see how we're not often mistreated. I'm not Orthodox myself. Maybe one day I'll learn how to read the Torah. But if someone has gone to the effort to reach that level of accomplishment, how can she be? It's like a personal insult to women that have become accomplished in their own fields. I was a lawyer. We have female rabbis here. We have all kinds of female professionals and employees. It's such an anachronism to us to all of a sudden say, no, you can't do this. By birth, you can't do this. I just wanted to give you a
I realize it's painful and it's difficult, and I think that one of the things we need to do here is understand that we have, and that's what I debated about coming tonight, not coming to my David Siegel conference today, and I said I didn't come. I told Dr. Geller I wasn't going to come. I thought it was going to be shoot up at the OK Corral, and I really got shot. But seriously speaking, there is an honest conflict here over ideology and philosophy and theology. And there was an effort at the wall to make a compromise. And Anat Hoffman knows this. But at the same time, just like in the Orthodox world, we need to learn to respect the spiritual quest that's going on in the liberal part of the Jewish world, even though it's not in the context that we are comfortable with. At the same time, which is something which I believe is very strong, and the fact that I live in Orange County, where, thank God, the Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox rabbis get along pretty well. We agree to disagree in a very civil kind of way, much better than Los Angeles. Why do they have to schlep a guy from Orange County to come here? And let me tell you, it was worse traffic than the 405. But the fact of the matter is, this is not about feelings, there's an honest theological disagreement. And I think that there is women who come to the pray at the wall with a tremendous amount of deep emotional feeling, and I have to respect that quest that they have within them. At the same time, there's a tradition that I think is very valuable. We have to find a way to talk to women. I honestly believe in Anat Hoffman. I think what the police did to her is outrageous. I've seen the police arrest many people in Jerusalem, and they're equal opportunity abusers. The police in Israel, but with in LA, the guys would have been, they would have been already sent. The FBI would have investigated them. Okay. But I think we have to be sensitive to each other's feelings and do that.
Hi, my name is Anne Golden. I'm an American Jew who's never been to Israel, nor do I speak Hebrew. I'm a member of this congregation. And I want to thank you all for being here, because I would like to see more of these town halls. I think this is just a beginning for us. I have 3 questions, and I want to frame it up into defense. The first question is a point of information, which is, with the Reform rabbis, or the rabbis that are non-Orthodox, when they marry, the ones who are paid by the Ministry of Sports, can they marry, can they bury, is what they do official. Number 2, the question regarding the choices. If there is not, it seems to me that if there's a range of people attending the Orthodox services, but not really being satisfied, I wonder if there weren't a bigger menu of options paid for by the state that were legal, if you wouldn't find people leaving the Orthodox schools and finding any number of other places to worship in the spectrum. And the other thing I think many of us American Jews are concerned about is extremism. And to say that we disagree is the starting point, and it's true, but I would ask you to have more town halls than what that disagreement, because for those of us American Jews who care about Israel, whether you call us Zionists or not, who care deeply whether we've been there or not, whose identity for generations and thousands of years is Jewish, I want to ask, where it says, when we talk about translating, going back to original text, there's a division of men and women up there.
Okay, I just want to who wants to grab a
We could have a whole evening just for these questions. We should have another meeting just about these questions.
In regards to your second question, if there was a greater menu of options, if there were more Masorti shuls, or I think greater publicity, if Israelis knew that the Masorti shuls offered the kind of Judaism that speaks to them, then yes, I do think that there would be a greater attraction to these synagogues. Tzipi Livni spoke to over 200 conservative rabbis at the Rabbinical Assembly a few years ago in Las Vegas. I know it's kind of a funny statement. But she stood in front of us and said, I feel so comfortable with you. I had no idea how comfortable I would feel praying with you, eating with you, discussing with you, etc. I have a feeling that that's the statement of many, many more Israelis. How comfortable they would feel if they were praying in the Sorti Shul. How comfortable they would feel knowing that the Sorti Shuls offer special needs B'nai Mitzvah programs, no matter what denomination you associate yourself with. So, very much so. I think if we knew the greater menu of options, then I do think Israelis would vote with their feet.
Thank you. I wanted to thank all the panelists.
I want to thank you all for coming tonight and the panelists for being here. I think it's a very important conversation. If I could just indulge you, who in this room feels that this issue is a very important issue in your life, in your identity, in your community?
Which issue?
The issue that we're talking about tonight. Clearly. Jewish life, Jewish identity, religion. We believe that it's very, very important. And one of the things that we discussed as members of this panel, and it was just the beginning of this idea, is to maybe put together a task force on Klal Yisrael in Los Angeles. There would be a task force that would be dealing with what unites us, not what divides us. Because sitting here, I can tell you that part of my feeling tonight is that we're rearranging seats on the Titanic, because the people that are really important are the people that are not in this room tonight. Those that are disengaged, that are alienated in their debates about how many there are, we need to find ways to engage the Jewish world and to do it better and more creatively. Now, I am here, and our consulate is here, and many people are from the consulate here tonight, by the way. I'm not going to introduce all of them, but it just shows you how important this issue is to us, that you understand, that you remain connected, that you double down and realize that there's change and that you have an opportunity to help Israel change. Now, the only societies that don't change are dictatorships, and they also change. Certainly the democracy, like the United States, there are many imperfections. And in Israel, in our democracy, some of us were raised on a model of perfectionism. Israel's not perfect. We're only the beginning of redemption. Remember, we're not redemption. We're the beginning. We're in that process. So what we would like to do is to work as healers in this community and educators in this community, and not to tell you that everything is great in Israel, because there are many challenges in Israel. Any democracy, certainly the Israeli democracy. Certainly when you have people from 100 different cultures that came at different times and have different understandings of what being Jewish means or being anything means. So we would invite all of you to be part of this with us. And I think many rabbis and community leaders would be interested in joining in this type of task force so that we have more town hall meetings like this, that we have more engagement like this, so that we bring some of these people here, not to schnorr, but to help you connect deeper to what is happening in Israel today. So for that, we want to thank all of you for being here.
I want to remind you that there's cookies, and that you can see this and pass this video along. It'll be posted on JewishJournal.com, and we're going to conclude with Cantor Young Pedro singing Hatikva, so please stand.
Please join me.
So
Dio tan voci,